Good evening, and thank you all for joining us both here in the auditorium and by live stream. It's really wonderful to be here this evening. My name is LaBrent Chrite, the 9th president of Bentley University. For the past year, Bentley has been working with Gallup to explore the answer to some questions that we find to be both timely and provocative. Among them, how do Americans feel business is doing when it comes to making a positive impact on society? What constitutes a positive impact? Who do people think is more effective at improving people's lives, business or government? And in which areas are businesses falling short of Americans' expectations, among other things? As a university that strongly believes in business as a force for good in society, and one that for over a century has been educating business leaders for tomorrow, it's imperative that we understand where business is headed and how we can best position our institution and the leaders that we educate to ensure that business and the private sector can be at its best. I can tell you that direction, where business is headed, is changing. And these changes are in many ways consequential. The role of business in shaping our society is evolving and growing in ways that are sometimes difficult to reconcile. Americans today expect more from the private sector than mere profitability and shareholder wealth creation. The bottom line and financial viability are, of course, still paramount. Businesses must, in fact, pass the market test. But that may no longer be enough for long-term competitiveness and profitability. Americans expect businesses to be aware of and act upon the important role that they can and should assume in moving society forward. And they're willing to reward the ones who do that with their business and with their loyalty. It appears increasingly that doing good is good business. The belief in a broader role of business is evident for Americans of all ages, but as our Bentley Gallup Force for Good survey revealed, this is especially true for Gen Z and millennials. The future of our nation's workforce and consumer base. That's why these changing expectations for how businesses ought to act should matter to every company and employer in the country. So this is our first year of an extended partnership between Bentley and Gallup, with a new survey and new findings coming out each of the next few years. We believe that tracking these data will help us all better understand how people's views of business are changing at a time when the impact of businesses on our own society has never been more critical. I'm excited for tonight's conversation to be joined here by such an exceptional panel of industry executives, leaders from some of the most respected companies in the nation, all with local roots, many of whom we'll bring to the stage shortly. We're so grateful for you all being here tonight as well. I want to thank the Boston Globe for hosting this event. We're really excited about this partnership. And I also want to acknowledge and thank Gallup. Over the past year together, we've surveyed more than 5,000 Americans to learn what they think about business and the role that business plays in today's society. As I've already teased, the survey uncovered some interesting findings. So before our panel begins, I would like to invite our partner from Gallup, Stephanie Marken, to share a brief overview of the results and some highlights from this report.
Good evening. I just want to thank President Chrite and the entire Bentley University team really for allowing us to be a part of this research. My name is Stephanie Marken. I'm Executive Director of Education Research at Gallup, which means I just have the pleasure of working with universities like Bentley on really important research like this. And I've had the pleasure of helping the Bentley team think about how we would approach this complex topic about how do you ask Americans what they think of businesses and their role in the societies in which they live. And so it's a real pleasure to see those results take hold and the incredible conversation that will unfold this evening. So I'm going to start off with just a few key findings from the research that we conducted together. And of course, those are just a small snapshot of insights that are featured in the fuller report. So please do read that full report as you have time, because there's so much more that we couldn't possibly cover this evening. But I'll start off with the insights that we felt were particularly poignant and pressing and important to cover as we engage in the conversation this evening. So, of course, among these key insights, these are all based on interviews among about 5,700 U.S. adults aged 18 and over who we interviewed via the Gallup panel. And for those of you who are a little less familiar with the Gallup panel is just a probability-based panel of U.S. adults. We have about 100,000 individuals who've been randomly selected among the general population, lucky them, and have been invited to participate in ongoing surveys with Gallup. We invite them to take those surveys via a variety of methods. For the purposes of this research, we interviewed individuals via a web-based survey, and we asked them a series of questions about their attitudes towards businesses, the extent to which business could be that force for good in society, the extent to which big business versus small business was having a more positive or negative impact on people's lives. But we also asked them a series of questions about their backgrounds and demographic characteristics, because of course, as is increasingly the case, we imagine that people would really differ systematically on the topics that we were covering based on their own demographic backgrounds, and that was certainly the case, which you'll see featured in the full report. But among the more important findings were these 4 findings. First off, that just about half of Americans reported they felt like business in general, businesses overall, were having an extremely or somewhat positive impact on their lives. And a very small proportion were rather negative about the impact of business, with a good number of individuals weighing in a neutral state. Now, I should note that was pretty consistent across demographic characteristics and groups. We also asked individuals to weigh in on a series of factors that we thought businesses should be and often are focused on. Things like investing in their local communities, investing in charities, participating in those types of organizations, using sustainable products as they think about manufacturing, et cetera. So of course, across all of these individual factors, we were interested in understanding which are the most important to Americans throughout the U.S. And also importantly, how would they rate performance among the business community on these important metrics. Now, you'll see in the findings detailed in the report that people really differed tremendously in their attitudes towards those various factors, but overwhelmingly, employee respect certainly came to the top of that list. Also among those top priorities for individuals were issues of making money in what people called ethical ways. Now, also importantly, you'll see that among these 2 most important factors, they were also the 2 factors in which people felt like businesses had the most work to do. So they were less likely than on other factors to rate businesses doing an excellent or a good job in these areas. We also asked a really pressing issue for so many leaders, including probably many people in this room, which is, to what extent should businesses be weighing in on issues of cultural or social importance? We've seen really businesses struggle, I think, in this area over the course of the past few years, but really over the course of the last decade in terms of if, how, and when they should participate in these conversations. And Americans were really divided on this. We did see really stark differences based on demographic characteristics. So if you were young, if you were a Democrat, if you identified as an Asian or Black American, you were more likely than your peers to report that you thought organizations and businesses should take a public stance on these cultural and social issues. And finally, because of course one of the greatest challenges over the course of the last really 2 years is how you attract and retain good talent, we were interested in understanding the extent to which people would leave their current employer if they thought the employer they would go to was making a positive impact on the world around them. And we found overwhelmingly that actually a pretty large percentage of the workforce was willing to leave their current employer, and in some cases they were actually willing to take a pay cut to do so. So looking at each of these individual findings in more detail, this is this first issue, right? Half of Americans report they think that businesses are having a pretty strong and positive impact on people's lives. Now, we asked this question among several different options. We asked first about businesses overall, and you'll see here that 14% of individuals for whom we interviewed reported they thought businesses overall were having an extremely positive impact. Another 41% thought they were having a somewhat positive impact on people's lives. Now, when we asked this about big businesses versus small businesses, you can imagine people were even more positive about the impact that small businesses were having on people's lives as compared with big business. And that's pretty consistent with how most people think about small business. They have a really strong and positive affiliation with small businesses. But these findings were really consistent regardless of demographic characteristics. That is, if you were younger versus older, more educated, less educated, you felt pretty similarly on this important question. Now, on the second question we asked, as you'll remember from my first remarks, we asked a series of questions about different issues that businesses could be focused on, right? So engaging in that local community, using sustainable products in your manufacturing process. We had countless items that we asked on a series of questions, and we asked individuals to reflect upon how important that topic was, how much they wanted business to focus on these issues, and then also how they would rate their performance on those issues. Now, among these many different topics on many different categories of issues that business could be focused on, we found these were the three most important to individuals for whom we interviewed. That is, 92% of people that we surveyed felt as if employee respect and treating your employees with respect was very important to them. And yet you'll see only about a third of people who we interviewed, 33%, also reported they thought businesses were doing an excellent or a good job at that. So a real stark difference as you think about perceived importance versus perceived performance. And similarly, we saw 83% of Americans reported they thought that it was extremely important that individual businesses actually make money in an ethical way, and yet only 32% feel as if businesses are doing an excellent or a good job at that. And you'll see this issue of employee wages, right? Having fair wages for employees of all types was also incredibly important, and yet people feel like there's a lot of work to do among the business community on that topic. Now, this next question, we saw really significant differences by demographic group. This is one of the items that differed most based on who you were, your party affiliation, your age category. Even for men and women, there were slight differences in how they answered this really important question. But Americans are really divided on this issue about whether or not businesses should be taking a public stance on issues of social and cultural relevance. And we've seen so many businesses struggle with this over the course of the past few years. What we found is this really differed based on your demographic background. So for women and men, there were slight differences. Women were slightly more likely, as you see here, to report that they do think businesses should be taking that public stance as compared with their male peers. But the issue of age was a more significant differences, right? So 59% of those in our youngest age category, those 18 to 29, reported that they thought that businesses should be taking that public stance, as compared with just about half of every other age group for whom we interviewed, even less so for those who are over the age of 60. You'll see on this issue of race ethnicity, we also see significant differences, right? So Asian and Black Americans were far more likely than their peers to report that they felt as if businesses should be taking that public stance, at 74% and 72% respectively, compared with just 49% of those who identified as Latinx or Hispanic, and 41% of those who identified as white. And then finally, of course, and maybe not surprisingly to some in this room, there were significant differences based on party affiliation. Democrats were overwhelmingly, felt very strongly that businesses should be taking that public stance at 75%, compared with just about 40% of those who identified as independents and a really small proportion of Republicans. So on this last issue, we hear so many good questions about this. What does it take to attract and retain talent? At Gallup, we've been studying employee engagement for the better part of the last 40 plus years, so we have a lot of points of view on that, but we were really interested to understand in this particular study, how much does being a force for good work for an individual brand? How does it help them attract talent? How does it help them retain talent? So we asked those who are currently in the workforce the extent to which they'd be willing to leave their current employer if they were to go to an organization that had made that positive impact on the world around them. Actually, a pretty large percentage of the workforce reported they would be willing to do so, which should worry people who are working really hard to attract and retain talent. But 55% of those who were currently employed for an employer in some individual category or industry were willing to leave. And when we asked those who were willing to leave, would you be willing to take a pay cut to do so? An actually pretty significant proportion said, I'd be willing to take as much as a 10% pay cut in order to go to another organization in which I was making that positive impact. So I'm going to pause there. As I mentioned, there's so many more insights to read about and learn about through the individual report that was released this morning, but I'm going to turn it back to the Bentley team for continued conversation.
Thanks very much, Stephanie. Really appreciate that really interesting summary. Now, we want to kick off a conversation with the three accomplished and respected individuals who will be joining us. And again, thank you all for taking the time out of your evening to join us. And so first, let me introduce from Liberty Mutual Executive Vice President and Chief Administrative Officer, also one of my bosses as a trustee, Melanie Foley. Thanks for being here. State Street CEO, Ron O'Hanley. And Deloitte Deputy CEO of Strategic Initiatives, Alicia Rose. Thank you all. So I know I speak to all of us when I say how much we just appreciate your participation. Very much looking forward to the conversation. Please join me on stage. Great. So this will be the only question I'm going to ask each of you to respond to, but I think it's important to sort of tee this up and get us going. One of the more interesting data points that we saw in the survey was that increasingly there are clear signals of a general mistrust of institutions in both the public and private sector for the majority of Americans. And yet, even within that context, pretty clear indication for the majority of folks that they have a higher level of trust in business and that their expectations of business for actually having a positive impact on society seems pretty clear. What does that mean for you all as executives? How does that affect your culture? And tell us also briefly, and I'll start with you, Alicia.
Okay.
How does that affect the culture of your organization?
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, and welcome everybody. Trust is absolutely critical to achieving so many of the goals that each of the corporations have set out. I would tell you, you've asked about how trust impacts the culture. Trust is at the core of our culture. When we reflect on what the components of trust are, we think about us as an organization having capabilities, being reliable, focused in on humanity and transparency. And those are really the four factors that we really define trust by. And we spend quite a bit of time with our employees and our clients making sure we're meeting the needs that they have with respect to those four attributes and those four factors of trust.
Thank you. Ron?
Let me begin by saying that I think this mismatch and the fact that business is more trusted than government, we shouldn't necessarily feel good about, right? And by that I mean, I think it's great for businesses to be wearing that mantle, but it also means we need to work on government. Maybe that's a topic for a different day. But you know, for us, we truly are in the trust business. Our formal name is State Street Bank and Trust. And if you think about financial services in general, it is all about trust. Somebody is entrusting us money. If it's a traditional bank, they're putting money into a deposit account in the hopes they're going to get it back. If it's an insurance company, they're paying into for an insurance policy in the expectation that should they need it, they'll get it back. So I think trust is at the core. I also think that trust is increasingly something that people look for in their institutions. There's been so many instances where the institution has let the individual down. And we've seen it just across all types of businesses, all types of institutions, even not-for-profits. So I think the expectation of trust is very, very high, and that's something that as leaders, we all have to focus on and deliver and ask ourselves, are we somehow undermining the trust that's been placed in us, whether it's by our clients, our employees, our shareholders, in our case, we're a public company, or the community.
Thank you.
Okay.
Melanie?
Plus one. Yeah, so over the last several years, or since right before the pandemic, when it became increasingly apparent that government was really struggling, and customers and employees were looking to corporations to address social problems, to address governance problems, to address climate problems, all of these things. The burden, it was felt in a very visceral way for us at Liberty Mutual, for sure. And I believe that, I mean, as Ron pointed out, as an insurance company, we need our customers to put trust in us. Like, progress happens when people feel secure. People feel secure when they have insurance policies to help protect the things that they cherish, the things that they build. And if we don't do what we don't do what we say we're going to do for our customers or for our employees, then they're not going to trust us, and therefore they're not going to bring their business back to us. Employees are not going to continue to work for you if they can't trust you. So I guess my message is, do what you say you're going to do and be transparent. I think those are the keys to earning trust in your culture and with your stakeholders.
Yeah, thank you. So for universities like Bentley, we are engaged intimately with Gen Z students and millennials, and we talk about the values that they hold, and you all know them well. You recruit them and seek to retain them. And more than any other demographic, they do believe in the obligation of business to do good. But there's also a school of thought that suggests that this sort of demonstrable, affirmative, intentional commitment to doing good is a tax on the firm. And so I'm curious as to how, in fact, do you reconcile the obligation of the organization to increase shareholder value while attracting those students and these young employees with very strong expectations? Is that not an incongruence that you have to struggle with?
I'm happy to start. I think that one of the reasons that this generation is, if you will, so much further along and have higher expectations is they've also got more information on us and these institutions than certainly I had on my first employer. And so out of sight, out of mind, you didn't really know what was going on. No, to be fair, we would probably all say that not all the information is accurate. Not all the so-called facts are real facts, but it's a very informed generation. And so we should take advantage of that and recognize that we have an obligation to be equally transparent to them. I think this comes back to, though, it's also a generation, because of this information, that is increasingly trying to understand, what is the purpose of my work, and therefore what is the purpose of the firm that I'm working for. And I think that's a burden, particularly on large businesses, because if you're sitting at the top of your organization, you know what the purpose is, and more often than not, it is a pretty lofty, noble purpose. We talk about our purpose being to help the world's institutional investors achieve better outcomes for themselves and the people they serve, right? It's, we think about all the retirees that we serve. But if you're an entry-level person and you're doing fund accounting for us in Quincy, that may not be entirely apparent how that fits into that. And so I think it's an obligation to be able to take that purpose and tie it to everybody's work. And I think that those high expectations, they're good for the employer, in my mind. I don't think it's a bad thing.
I was a young auditor and audited the fund accountants at State Street. And I remember my dad talking to me about the larger purpose. Yeah. And an audit is about building trust, and that I was contributing to society in that way. Yeah. So it is about making that story and that connection so people understand the meaning of what they're doing.
Yeah. Yeah.
I would flip the question a little and say, how can we even envision a global economy continuing to grow if we don't marry purpose and profit, right? If the sentiment of the generation that is buying our products, that is consuming our services, that is working for our companies, they're telling us what you just saw here. And so a company that doesn't respond to that in an appropriate way is going to be uncompetitive. And so it just seems obvious to me that we have to, as Ron's point, every company needs to understand what is their purpose, right? What were you created to do? How have you evolved that? And what would the world be like if you didn't exist? And help your employees, in my case, or your customers, see the value, they see the reason why you exist. And then you can cascade that down to that auditing clerk to say, what would happen if you didn't exist? How would we not be able to fulfill our purpose? And if you respond well and you're competitive, then you're going to grow, you're going to have scale for more innovations, to provide opportunities for more people. And so it's this self-fulfilling.
Yeah, thank you. Mel, you mentioned earlier, George Floyd, and I think all of us can go back to that period, the extraordinary divergence in morbidity and mortality for COVID, George Floyd, sort of political proclivities at that time, and nationalism, and this seemed to have triggered the recognition of private businesses to engage and step up and say something. But give me a sense as to what your obligation and role is in terms of deciding when to speak up and how to do so that you don't risk alienating at least some sizable portion of your constituency and stakeholders. Yeah. Alicia, you want?
Sure. What I think my favorite poll answer was the one that described that 48% of Americans think we shouldn't speak out and 52% think we should. And that just summed up a lot of the tension that I think leaders have experienced over the past couple years, trying to recognize when should we speak up and what should we say if we're going to speak up. And I think it's really important for organizations to reflect on how they're going to make these choices so that they can be consistent. Otherwise, you end up sort of at the mercy of every single topic, and you could spend all your time trying to decide what to say. We have really reflected on a couple of questions that we ask ourselves. One is the topic aligned with our shared values? So really understanding your purpose, the organization's shared values, what you are committed to. The second and third are really about stakeholder expectations. And so again, it's no longer just shareholders that you answer to. As an organization that's focused on purpose and committed to purpose, you need to understand what your employees think, what your clients expect, what your customers expect. And so recognizing and thinking about the topic as to whether they would expect your organization to speak on this topic. There are other things to think about, whether you can meaningfully influence the topic. And what is the cost of speaking out or not speaking out? And so it's a series of questions that we really sort of reflect on each topic. And it is by no means easy because you will hear from 52% of your organization that thinks you should and 48% that says don't. So
I think that's really well said, and all I would add to that is that because we go through a similar calculus, I suppose, although it happens in the moment, and it's also very emotional, no matter how dispassionate you want to be. But there's some things that you just kind of, they cross the line. And, in my mind, too, that have occurred over the past several years. One was George Floyd, that it was just, there was no consultation of of what you described. For me, it occurred over a weekend. And it was also very important to me that I just can't express sorrow. Like, this has happened too many times. And so what are we as an institution going to do about it? And what's within our power? And that was actually one healthy for me, and I'd like to think healthy for the organization, because it really did get us thinking and talking about what can we actually do about this. And it turns out there's a lot, and since then we've been actually executing against that. The other, of course, was January 6th, and there was probably, I think, we all felt we needed to say something, but we all knew that there was a real risk in saying something, but did so anyway. Just because the feeling was, it's just that both of those crossed a societal line, that it didn't matter who you are or where you were from.
Throw Roe v. Wade into that mix, and it does become very difficult. And the only thing I would add is it's not always easy, no matter how senior in an organization you are, to put your own personal beliefs aside. And so really doing that thoughtful planning, having a framework, being able to have people hold each other accountable to say, this has to link back to our company's values. This has to link back to the way that we operate. And there's lots of issues out there where that's very, very polarizing. But we found that letting our employees have space to have conversations within our walls where they may not feel safe outside of our environment to have those conversations has actually been a way to take action, to say we're going to provide forums through our employee resource groups so that you can either get yourself educated on these matters or find support from others. Rather than taking a position, we've provided a platform for people to have conversation.
So much emphasis is put on the statement, and I think more emphasis should be put on the actions. You described actions that you put in place and actions, sort of brave space conversations. What are you doing for healthcare for your individuals and employees? What are you doing about voting and providing people time to vote? And so the actions, I think, should continue to speak louder than the words, but so much emphasis is put on, are you making a statement? What's the statement?
Yeah, thank you for the focus on actions. I'm just, as you were saying, I was reflecting on, one of the things that's been in the news of late is this sort of maybe a skewed incentive because of the narrative and because of values and to position oneself across a, for lack of a better term, political spectrum and do what is determined by large segments of the population to be correct, and in doing so, you misreport your success, you misstate your progress. I'm thinking, of course, of greenwashing and as it relates to sort of ESG, and there's a very large private equity company that just got hammered by overstating its progress on these quote unquote sort of progressive issues. Is that a focus of sort of institutional integrity, just poor communication, something else going on? But how can firms mitigate the risk of going too far because it seems popular and end up dealing with blowback?
Yeah, we've taken, when we take a look at ESG matters and think of climate, to continue with your example, you watch your competitors and what they're doing and who's first to say we're going to have we'll be net zero by this date, or we'll reduce our emissions, et cetera. And then you have this pressure like, everybody else is doing it. But the approach that we've taken is we have to be honest with ourselves about what we really can accomplish and just put it out there that maybe we can't achieve the ultimate goal. We don't know how we're going to get there now, but we know how we're going to get halfway there, and so we're going to disclose that, rather than taking up initiatives that we don't understand or don't know if they're going to really play out a couple of years down the road, like the voluntary carbon markets or other things that that's not something that we're that ready to commit to at this point in time. So it's about being honest with yourselves about what your capabilities are and being transparent in the communication around that. And I think that will keep you out of trouble.
Right. No doubt. Thank you. So 83% of the people in our survey indicated that businesses should create opportunities for low socioeconomic groups. This is perhaps heightened by a mistrust in the public entities or government that have historically been obligated to do that. Can you give me a sense of what role, if any, businesses ought to assume in providing a redress for sort of skewed concentration of wealth, unequal wage distribution, and poverty?
So I'll start. I think it goes back to when I opened. Business is not a substitute for government, and business is not a substitute for good policy making. And I think we've, in many cases, not always, we've lost the ability to make good policy. I mean, in the old days, there'd be sweeping policy, and then it would get fixed, right? Because you didn't get it right the first time. Now it's either a focus on getting it so perfect that nothing happens, or it's simply one side trying to stop the other from doing that. And I don't believe, actually, that business can be a substitute for that. On the other hand, there are areas where we can make a difference. And the term du jour is stakeholder capitalism, which is, it's a provocative word. I happen to like it because I think it captures what's going on. But the other way to think about it is simply this. Most businesses have an aspiration to be in business for a long time, maybe even forever. Most of our investors, at least in the public markets in the United States, actually are retirement plans and college savers and things like that. They've got very long-term liabilities too. So there's a nice alignment of long-term here. And over the course of a quarter, you can probably get away with anything. Over the course of the long term, you actually can't get away with mistreating your employees, mistreating your supply chain, not investing in the communities that you're in, and then wondering why you're not getting good employees. So I actually think that if you just think about what is it that's important to my firm for the long term, and shareholder return is not a goal, it's an outcome. So if I serve my clients and customers well, if I have good ethical products, if I avoid kind of getting on the wrong side of the law, if I develop my communities, if I don't actually mistreat the environment and either find it's a place that my people don't want to live or that in fact I'm on the wrong side of the law, I think this all aligns. And so I believe there's much more we can and should do and can be done under the objective of I'm here to build long-term value for our shareholders.
Thank you.
I would add to that some would say maybe there's an obligation. I'm going to say there's just an opportunity that businesses have really, have that opportunity to engage with employees in a different way and to invite individuals into the organization. So one of the things that we've done at Deloitte is started a program called MADE, Making Accounting Diverse and Equitable. And we know we need to really do that in our communities, put money into the communities, scholarship money, and start in towns and communities at a much earlier age, helping folks understand the opportunities in accounting and getting that level of education. We're also looking at something that's very unique for something we've done is actually considering hiring individuals without four-year degrees. And we're part of the coalition of about 60 or 70 organizations supporting 110 that's really committed to having 1 million Black Americans without four-year degrees join the business community and join families and wage-sustaining jobs. So they're excellent opportunities. And if you view it as an obligation, they'll get done faster, I'm sure.
It's great. You should make sure you let us know how we can be a part of that.
Absolutely.
Sounds amazing. So, Ron, you said something earlier about, we shouldn't be proud of the fact that, public policy and public officials and public entities seem to be held in such low regard, and I really appreciate that. And I've always viewed sort of the private sector as imperfect as it is, as a beacon for what can represent the best of Western history and of this country. And I wonder, Melanie, let's start with you. Do you all see areas of convergence between your organization and its capacity to enable and support more effective public policy and sort of public institutions, and what does that look like?
Yeah, I mean, we believe that it's an all-hands-on-deck problem when you're talking about equity and opportunity. And so I do believe that, one, we can lead by example, but we also need these partnerships. And we get involved in partnerships like Hacked Diversity, Apprenti, looking to pull up folks into apprenticeship programs where maybe the access to education isn't equal, and making sure that we bring them in and provide them with training and development so that they can have very successful careers. One of the approaches that we're looking at taking is, what are the superpowers that we have as an organization? So think of property and casualty insurance. We know a lot about climate risks and how they affect people's lives. We know a lot about data and analytics. We want to take those superpowers and then partner with middle schools and high schools and community colleges and bring what we have to bear to these institutions to help young people start to get interested and understand what the careers are down the road, because we really believe that we need to go deeper into our school systems to educate and pull folks up into what career in corporate America can really look like.
Ron, you want to talk about that?
Yeah, so I think that having said what I said about government, I actually think where it all works best is when there actually are these partnerships, because there are things that we can do that government can't. And there's a lot of things that we can't do that government can. And I think that this city is a great illustration of that. It's a great illustration of why you want to have a thriving business community, because if you look at all the things, all the really big things that have happened here, whether you liked them or you didn't like them, the harbor cleanup, the desegregation of Boston schools, the big dig, the response to COVID, I mean, those all happen with a very strong and almost instantaneous kind of matching up of government with the business community. And some of the things that Melanie's describing, these are very long-term investments that the business community has made into the educational system here. And it's those kinds of things that work well. It works even better then when you have, whether it's the universities, and we're blessed with so many good, really good universities here, in the not-for-profit sector. And that kind of thing works well. I mean, I'd much rather be in a place like this where there's just this rich diversity of institutions, as opposed to you get to these situations where it's the so-called one company town, and there's just an awful lot imposed on that institution, an awful lot expected of them. And honestly, we can't bring to the table some of the things that Deloitte can or that Liberty can, and that's the beauty of being in a community like this.
The complexity of the issues that we're all trying to solve will take everyone. It will take, just as you said, the organizations, the corporations, the government, the nonprofit sectors, the universities. It will take everyone, and it will take a long time. And so building that trust with each other and continuing it is critical.
So we happen to believe at Bentley that the pluralism that we see in this country, that the diversity, the rich sort of history of inclusivity is in fact one of the country's strengths, and we think both academic and professional organizations ought to be aligned with that, because it's a competitive issue. Well, it's also the right thing to do, but this is not a sort of a monolithically held point of view, and few issues raise the sort of concerns of large segments of the population than focusing on D&I and focusing on diversity and focusing on inclusion, to the point of sort of cynicism, and just very difficult to have sometimes productive conversations. And as organizations that have affirmed your commitment to this, I mean, help us understand how and why you, in fact, defend those principles. Alicia?
I guess I'll start with the why. The why we defend them is because we actually know that it is good. You know, it's the force for good that you've talked about. We know that DEI matters. The how, what we've been on a journey at Deloitte. Just last year in 2021 and now 2022, we've released a transparency report, which as a private company and a partnership is a very big step. And choosing to put out a lot of data around our organization and reflect on the fact that we're not where we want to be, but have goals to get to where we want to be is important, and to be very transparent and honest about it has been very powerful. And we've found that, you know, I think many people after the murder of George Floyd decided to evolve diversity and inclusion to include equity and put DEI and put equity into it. And that is absolutely important and probably the key. Many organizations have had recruiting and diverse goals for many, many years. And it hasn't been successful. And really starting to look at equity and understand in your own organization what might be broken in the processes that you might have that might be riddled with unconscious bias, and really reflect and try to address those things is important. And that's really how we're doing the how, is reflecting, being transparent, and focusing in on equity and allyship as well.
Melanie, you want to talk?
Yeah, as Alicia said, the business case has been made, right, for DEI, for focusing on diversity and inclusion. It's good for business. It makes you more innovative. It aligns your employee population with the customers that you're trying to serve. I'm fortunate to work for a company that truly cares, that we firmly believe that racism is awful. Inequities are awful things that we want to eradicate. And so because there's such a deep commitment to the value system of the company, we wear it as a badge of honor that this is hard work. And all transformations are hard, especially when you're dealing with thousands and thousands of humans. It could be easier a lot of days to just give up because it's so hard, but because we so firmly believe that this is the right thing to do, and we have the conviction, we have the persistence, and we will have the perseverance to close those gaps. You know, we similarly have transparency around where we stand on several demographic dimensions, but we're not there at all of our goals, but we have actions that we're going to take, and we're going to continue to hold ourselves accountable because we care.
Thank you.
It is so well said. The only thing I would add is I also think we have to avoid getting into the, or confront the debate that somehow diversity and merit cannot exist in the same sentence, because it's just a false positive. I mean, it is so proven so many times when a business or a business unit gets into trouble, and when you really root into it, you find out that there was some form of groupthink going on, and that everybody came from the same place, was thinking exactly the same way, and weren't ready or willing or even capable of taking on another perspective. So I think part of this is, in addition to the proven business case, is when the crisis comes, you really do want to have as broad a group of thinkers in the room as possible. And the only way you're going to get there is if you actually are truly diverse. In terms of how we are getting at it, I think you said it very well. It's recognizing that, okay, there's got to be a reason why we've been at this. We've had these diversity goals and we haven't gotten to where we wanted to be. You know, some of it was you just need to put some incentive around it and make it really important to people that not only is this going to get, it's going to get measured, it's going to manage, and we're going to pay based on that. But it's also recognizing that there are some often unintentional ways of going about things that are occurring in the organization that are simply inequitable. And when you start to root out those, it's amazing how things start to fall into place. And, you know, it's, again, in most cases, if not all, it wasn't that people were setting out to do something wrong, whether it was unconscious bias, it was even the way they put together panels in terms of interview panels or how they were thinking about resumes. You start to take all that stuff away and it starts to fall into place.
Oh, thank you for that. So, you know, these are difficult, multifaceted, complex issues, and you know, whether it's sustainable manufacturing, whether it's commitment to diversity and equity and inclusivity, whether it's addressing sort of, you know, pernicious sort of educational gaps and wealth concentration, reminding me of what someone said, of a nation we are aspects that are in need of sort of moral repair, if you will. But, you know, at some point, you have to sit back as a business executive and say, look, we just, you know, this is space in which we just, you know, just not willing to enter. Or this is space that we just don't feel that we have the capacity to affect change. Or this is space where it's just better that we move in another direction. I want to press you to ask you to give us a sense of what that space looks like, where the sort of discussions at the executive level really go, you know, a little more intense than they would normally, and where you might just say, look, we're just not ready to address a particular issue. Is there anything that comes to mind for you all?
I mean, we've certainly had the debate, and our debate typically is around, can we have an impact? And if we don't believe we can have an impact, then what we worry about is, okay, so it's just another empty promise out there. We actually have nothing to do with this or can't in any way influence it. So we're actually undermining, you know, everything that we are doing everywhere else. And it's not that quickly, by the way, because usually it's some employee, right, that is wanting us to do this. Sometimes it's a client. And so you've got to go back to them and explain, you know, why that is. And it's not that it isn't important or that, you know, I personally may have a strong point of view that actually is in agreement with this, but ultimately it's about, you know, can the institution have an impact?
That's what we reflect on. Can we have an influence on it? And Deloitte is a large organization, and we're serving many, many industries, but does it make sense for us specifically to speak out? And if we did speak out, what are our actions behind it? And can we really have that sort of level of influence?
Right. Okay. Each of you all have mentioned in your various responses the notion of culture. And Melanie, I'd love for you to give us a sense of how the culture that you're creating that enables you all to address these issues as part of your operating strategy. How is that culture serving you as a competitive advantage when recruiting and retaining employees?
Yeah, no, thanks. You know, we've been very clear with our employees and in a coherent, strategic, simple way of what our values are. So everybody understands how we operate, what is expected of them from a values perspective, what our purpose is, and these things help us make decisions, you know, every day. And our employees feel that we do live our values, and we see things like companies that care. So we're on the top 50 list of companies that care. Just last week, this Burning Glass research came out on opportunities. Liberty Mutual was ranked number 8 in the country on companies that provide folks the greatest opportunity to get equal pay, fair pay, and advancement opportunities. So we live by our values. We take actions that will have impact, and we let that recognition kind of be that reinforcing system that helps us to attract and retain employees. But we measure how well we're doing by employee sentiment on a very frequent basis. So we can't drink our own Kool-Aid. We are checking ourselves every month on how are we living our values and how are we doing in inspiring that kind of a culture.
Thank you. Ron, culture at State Street, competitive advantage?
So I think that most would say that strategy without culture, you're not going to get anywhere. You'd rather have a culture without strategy. You'll probably get further along. And for us, we define culture as the set of desired behaviors that advance our values and advance our strategy. So we spend a lot of time, both top down, but more importantly within the business units. What are these desired behaviors? What does that mean to how my work gets done day to day? It's also a really good way to activate younger members of the team, because again, going back to sometimes they can't see the full purpose and you got to keep reminding them, but they can certainly see how people are behaving. And they in their own way become in some ways the enforcers, right? Because they're the ones that are saying, okay, well, my supervisor isn't, there's 5 desired behaviors here and he or she's not doing 3 of them, and are quite willing to speak up. But that's how you inculcate culture, right? It's not just about, reading nice things on the wall or the elevator posters. It's what happens day to day in the organization. And if you express it in behaviors and desired behaviors, that's something that everybody in the firm can have a debate on.
Great, thank you.
I would echo what you just said. Everyday actions really trump strategy every single day of the week. And so it is the everyday actions of all across the organization. And so you might be able to sit as a CEO and proclaim something, but if a this fund accountant is feeling something different, that's what the real culture is. And so it's so important to make sure that the employees know what the behavior should be, what's expected of them, and actually get to create part of that culture and be part of it. And so I would absolutely echo what you said.
So we have time for just one more question, and I want to end on sort of maybe the other end of the spectrum from what I just asked, and start back on this end with you, Alicia. Where are businesses, in your view, falling short? Where can they be better? What do you reflect on when you think of sort of opportunities missed or renewed obligation for enterprises? What lessons can you
sure. I'm excited to have read this survey, and I hope all of you get the chance to sort of do a deep dive on it. I'd say 2 things. There's a great chart in there that actually goes through the expectations and the gaps. And Stephanie showed just 3 or 4 of them. I think that's the real opportunity, is every organization should reflect on what the expectations are and understand in their own organization how they're meeting it. We have a talent survey that we do annually that touches on some of those questions, and we actively look for where the gaps might be. Then more broadly, I would tell you, every conversation I have with clients, with C-suite executives, they are all very optimistic and focused on putting purpose at the core and really trying to address sustainability and equity. They often have 1 or 2 other goals tied to whatever their core business is. But I am very optimistic that businesses are really trying to address these complex social issues. They'll take a long time, though. I think many people are used to seeing results, sort of what's happening quarter by quarter, or setting an annual goal. And these are much longer term, and we're going to have the persistence and perseverance to stick with it. I think businesses will.
Ron, opportunities for improvement, things that business can do better?
I think businesses need to, be braver about how they define themselves and not let themselves be defined by others. Particularly for public companies, obviously you've got shareholders that are important, but my earnings day is tomorrow, so I'll be facing them all tomorrow. But you can't let you can't let the investor define you, right? Ultimately, in a public marketplace, you've got to lay out what you are, what you're setting about. The board has hired you, and the board is basically the the fiduciary to the shareholder. And if there's alignment, then don't let yourself get diverted by this every 13-week kind of appearing on the call and doing all this. I mean, keep tying it back to what you're trying to do long term. I mean, and this goes back to the mismatch that I was talking about earlier. So the real owners of the capital have long-term liabilities. I would argue that most management teams, contrary to popular belief, they're not thinking about the next quarter. They are thinking about the next several years. The breakdown is the actual investors, those that represent the holders of capital, because they've got on average a 9-month holding period. And so at some point you just have to push back on that and say, listen, this is what we need to do for the long term. This is why, and this is how we're going to go about it. And ultimately, good shareholders will actually come around to that. If you've done your job, they'll do theirs. But ultimately, if not, then it's probably not the shareholder you want to have. And be brave about that.
Yeah, thank you, Ron. Melanie, we'll give you the last word on this.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, I'll just underscore bravery and maybe just say courage. And businesses need to have more courage to take on the real difficult transformations, the difficult commitments, the difficult education of issues, so that they can really meaningfully make a difference. And sometimes it's easier to just put the words up on the wall, as Ron said, and not take the action behind it, or put out goals or statements that you really don't know how you're going to achieve those goals or statements, or just admit that we have a big gap, and that's okay because we're committed to filling that gap. We're going to keep trying, and we're not going to give up. But having the courage to do that, I think, is where businesses fall down.
Would you please join me in giving our panelists a really warm hand? It is just a real privilege for me to be up here with you, and thank you. And it's also a privilege, as I indicated, to prepare these amazing students of ours to become future leaders and business owners. And we happen to have one of our students here this evening, Samantha Lovering, who is going to ask a question from her perspective that we would ask our panelists to each take a shot at. Welcome.
Thank you, and first and foremost to our panelists, thank you so much for speaking. I really believe that this survey will propel us forward. Specifically as students, it was great to sort of see some of my own thoughts be reflected in the findings. As I enter the workforce as a senior, I'm entering an industry that is specifically heavily male-dominated. I really appreciated that as an intern, my firm really promoted gender equity and inclusion. I know that you have spoken to some of those policies about diversity, equity, and inclusion, but I was really wondering how you enforce that culture on an entry level for the employees coming into the firm, whether that be through everyday action or the sweeping policies in which you promote. Thank you.
Well, I'll get started. Yeah, sure. So thank you for that question, and best wishes as you graduate. I hope you love the company that you're with. It's not Liberty. I'd love to talk to you after. Shameless recruiting here. No, it's evident from the minute we start attracting talent into our organization through our employment value proposition, through our brand marketing, what we stand for, and diversity, equity, and inclusion is a huge part of who we are and what we're trying to do for the better of society, starting in our four walls. And so it's introduced through all of our onboarding. It is clear that managers are held accountable for advancing diversity, equity, inclusion in our organization. It's through our ERGs, so we have 7 employee resource groups. We have investment in training and really helping to build the inclusive skills of all employees from entry level all the way up to the CEO. The executive leadership team all has an executive DEI business advisor that we work with, that's someone outside of the company that each of us meets with on a monthly basis to continue to build our own skills. So it's from top to bottom, making sure that we all continue on this journey and develop inclusive leadership skills so that we can really make it evident through every interaction in the company that we stand behind this. Thank you.
Yeah, what I would add to that is that because we have a very similar set of actions and activities around this, but I would add mentorship and sponsorship. And they're not the same things, but they're both equally important, and really making sure that either naturally or through some guidance that there's mentorship in place, but that very quickly there's also sponsorship. And if that sponsorship typically needs to occur more naturally, and if it's not occurring, why is it not occurring? Why is this person not having the sponsorship? And sponsorships can be a word that people are thinking, well, what is this about the old boy or old girls network? And it's not that at all. It's mentorship is about, you come to me and I'll think big thoughts and say big things to you and help you along in whatever task. Sponsorship is, I'm going to actively lean in and support you and move you along. And that's not just on the individual. Oftentimes that's on the management team. Why in that organization has she not been able to develop a sponsor? What is it about that management team? So that is something that, again, you don't want to make it so unnatural that people are just checking the box, and the best ones actually do work naturally. But we're quite vigilant about saying, why is this not happening? What's not happening in that particular business unit?
So we have similar activities, so I know we were committing to not piling on. So I'm just going to bestow a wish on you. I started at Deloitte 30 years ago, so I remember your point in time being a senior, and it's actually when Deloitte started our women's initiative. And so I'm exactly 30 years ago, and so I'm very proud of that. And I know that it's done a lot to change. So I know whatever company you're with, one day you'll be sitting here talking about the amazing changes in your organization that you've been able to really ripple throughout. And so I congratulate you on where you're starting and all the students, and encourage you that when you get to where you are in the organization, to share your ideas, to raise your voice, to make sure that it doesn't just take a poll, that you actually share it in the everyday actions with the managers and the folks that you're working with every day. So,
Samantha, thank you for that great question. That concludes the panel session. Again, thank you all for your great insight, and thank you all for joining us this evening. I really appreciate it.